This is getting to the source of state dedicated funding for kids. The reason we're the ones hosting this webinar is because we are a national social impact nonprofit that really focuses on the question of how do we fund all of the big gaps in the prenatal to career opportunities that all children need to thrive. With fiscal mapping, you may have heard about us through cost modeling, and the focus of this webinar is really how do we fill the gaps that we identify between the fiscal mapping, what funding we currently have, and cost modeling, what do we need to create opportunities for all children to thrive. So the context for this paper is that we had some participation in a couple of state dedicated fund wins earlier in the 2020s. So you may have heard of Colorado's dedicated fund for early childhood, or you may have heard of New Mexico's big win dedicating funding to early childhood. And we got questions constantly from folks about how can I be the Colorado or how can I be the New Mexico? And we wanted to kind of answer some of those questions by showing the range, the breadth of existing dedicated funding for kids at the state level across the country. I think now more than ever, folks are very curious both about how do we get state generated resources and revenue to help fill gaps for kids in our communities and our states. And they're also curious, how do we get pots of funding that are dedicated, sustained, long-term pots of funding so that we aren't creating instability for all of the providers and communities that we work with in funding, and they can actually grow and expand and thrive. This paper is really kind of a more comprehensive look at all of the state dedicated funds for children outside of the K-12 school day that we've identified. And I am going to hand it over to Bruno Showers on our team, who did the lion's share of work in pulling this paper together, to talk more about it and to introduce our other panelists.
Hey everyone, yeah, thanks for being here and thanks for that level setting, Olivia. So just real quick, these are our panelists today. I'm Bruno Showers, State Policy Manager here at Children's Funding Project. You've heard from Olivia, our co-founder. Alex and Eva from Montana and Connecticut will be speaking later. I'll give them a little more of an introduction then. But I think it makes sense jumping into the content of the paper in our webinar today, just to kind of define more exactly what it is that we'll be talking about. So I know a few people in the chat mentioned local dedicated funding. Obviously, that's great and we support that, but this paper and this webinar today is focusing on funding that's dedicated at the state level. So, you know, the states having more resources than localities like cities or counties, while being more responsive to the federal government, or than the federal government is to the public and policy, or to the public and voters. So it kind of sits there in between those two. We're talking about funding that's specifically dedicated. So it's one, at least some of its enumerated uses are for programs for children and youth. And we are talking about public revenue. So a few of the funds that we discuss in the paper and that we'll be talking about today do rely on private philanthropic dollars to some extent. Most funds allow for donations, but candidly, the vast majority of the revenue that we'll be talking about is public, and often that means taxes, which the paper gets into, and we will as well in just a little bit. So Olivia touched on this a little bit, but I think it's also worth mentioning what it is that we're not talking about with this paper in this webinar. So obviously, I'm not saying that our K-12 and post-secondary systems are as well resourced as they need to be. But the focus of this paper is really outside of those systems. So looking at things like early care and education, after school and out of school programs, and other supports outside of that core academic pipeline, just because we believe that relative to those systems, these other ones have been underinvested in, particularly at the state level. So with that kind of level setting aside and definitions that we have in hand, maybe we can dive a little bit more into what exactly the paper is going to hopefully share with you. So in this paper, you'll find more than 40 years of history of state dedicated funds of this kind. So the first one being South Carolina in 1984. However, I think it's notable that most or about half of the funds that we identified were created in the last decade or so. In fact, since Louisiana created theirs in 2017, there's been at least one fund created and sometimes more than one fund created each year since then. So um, we'll be walking through some information about Louisiana specifically a little later in this webinar. We also have some resources on our website that tell more of that story and how our friends at the Louisiana Policy Institute for Children got that done. But so you see this timeline here, which will give you the year of creation as well as the utilization of the funds, and then information about the revenue mechanism that the fund relies on. And we'll talk about that more in a bit as well. So you can see here, visually displayed in a different way, a map of the state level funds that we identified, as well as the revenue source that they rely on. You might note that there are more funds than there are states that have funds. That's because a few states have more than one fund. They've utilized more than one funding mechanism to fund more than one program or service for children and youth. You can see here that there are a lot of different financing mechanisms that states rely on. And the exact options that are available to you will vary depending on your political and local context. But the paper will hopefully kind of guide you through these different revenue mechanisms, give you a brief understanding of what they are, and then some of the trade-offs involved as well. So on that note, in addition to information about the year of creation of the funds, the revenue mechanisms that they use, the utilization of the funds, the purposes that they're supposed to be used for, obviously we've tried to include information about what those revenue mechanisms are, considering there is such a broad variety. So briefly going through them, at least one state relies on a sales tax, general sales tax. So a tax on the consumption of goods and some services based on the sales price. Another common revenue stream for these funds is our excise taxes, which are essentially sales taxes on specifically enumerated activities or goods. Sometimes they're called sin taxes because they often target those kind of activities such as tobacco, marijuana, or gambling. Public settlement agreements like the tobacco master settlement agreement. A few states utilize that. Another trend that we're seeing more recently are states kind of tapping taxes on income and assets. So a couple examples of that, Vermont has a payroll tax that's dedicated to early child care. And Washington has a capital gains tax, which is dedicated to programs for children and youth as well. Land trust funds are worth pointing out. I think one of the big stories of the last few years was New Mexico's win, and their win was that they were able to dedicate some of this revenue to child care, which land trust funds revenue comes from like leasing public lands and resources for development. And then, although essentially all of these funds generate ongoing revenue from interest, a few funds only generate revenue from interest, and we've tried to identify those funds where we can as well. So in addition to like a brief description of these revenue mechanisms, I mentioned we also try to provide some information about how to think through the pros and cons of each. Not comprehensive, but some of the ideas that we throw out there is like, you know, the difference between a progressive tax, a tax that falls on those more with the ability to pay, or a regressive tax, right? One that falls on those with lower income working people. So giving you at least the basics of what you need to know and linking you to resources that can tell you more if you need to get more information about these. So I mentioned a couple slides ago that oftentimes these sources of revenue come online in response to new taxes, new activities. So here you see that when the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement came around, a few states dedicated that revenue to kids and youth. Another thing that we're seeing is as marijuana becomes legalized, that's becoming allocated to programs for children and youth. Gambling, as that's becoming legalized, that's becoming allocated to children and youth. And so one opportunity that we see is the social media litigation that's upcoming. In the paper, you can find more information about how to join these 40 states that are trying to allocate some revenue to after school and out of school programs in particular. And this information will be linked in the paper as well. But the bulk of the paper really is a collection of state fund profiles. So I think it's worthwhile kind of giving you a guide of how to look at these, what information they're providing you, and how to use them. So each of those funds has a profile that looks like this. It has a summary section, which will give you information on the funding sources that it uses, how much funding it has available. In the most recent year, we could find data, when it was enacted, and where the revenue goes. In addition to that, you'll find more information about the specific funding purposes and sources in that section. So Louisiana is a good example because, as you can see here, it has several different sources of revenue with different stipulations of maximum amounts. So you can find all of that technical information within this section of the profile, as well as the specific enumerated uses for which the fund is dedicated. Then in the administration and impact section, you'll find information about the particular structure of administration and governance of the fund, who's represented on the board that oversees it, if there's such a board, the specific department that runs or allocates the funds, gives out the revenue, as well as, to the extent possible, we've tried to include information like the actual impact. So ideally, number of children served when that information is available. And then the final part of each of these state profiles is this path to enactment section, which where possible, where we've been able to find it, we tried to give you more details about exactly how advocates on the ground campaigned for and won these funds. So that means key strategies they relied on, key partners they relied on, different messages that they tried, everything like that we could find out there, which just candidly, not all that information was always available. That said, so from those path to enactment sections, well, real quick, I wanted to acknowledge the folks that helped make this possible. So I mentioned that we tried to get that information where it was possible. One of the ways that we did that was by interviewing people on the ground, advocates who were involved in these different campaigns to win these state dedicated funds. And so wanted to mention those here. It wouldn't have been possible to put this together without their help, their input, their fact checking, the information they were able to give me that otherwise I wouldn't have been able to find. And from all that information, from the path to enactment sections, we've put together a lessons learned section that tries to kind of generalize what different states did, different advocates did, to give you an idea of what you could do to try and do something like this in your state. But instead of belaboring that point myself, we have a few partners here who I think it would be good to hear from directly. Both Montana and Connecticut recently got wins in this arena, and we thought, we've incorporated those learnings in the paper to the extent possible, but it's always good to hear straight from them. So I would love to give some time now to hear from our partners, and I'm going to pass it to Alex from 0 to 5 in Montana, so that she can talk about how Montana did something there this year.
Thanks so much, Bruno. I'm so excited to be here and dig into this wonderful resource that is being put together and share a little bit about our recent early childhood policy win in Montana. Next slide. A little bit about our organization. 0 to 5 Montana is a nonpartisan statewide early childhood organization that's really focused on increasing access to early care and education, strengthening families, and uplifting voices while empowering small businesses and communities. In a nutshell, we really focus on solutions that work toward a Montana dedicated to every child. We've been around for a little over 6 years, have learned a ton over those years. You can skip forward to the next slide. And you can go to the next one. Thanks, Bruno. I want to start by giving you a little background and context before we jump into the meat of our policy win. Montana is a really relatively conservative state, and our legislature meets every other year and odd number years. Historically, we haven't invested hardly any state dollars, a maximum of like $1 million along with our state match. So we rely really heavily on federal funding to support our early childhood programs and services. So in 2021, 2022, our state had a Republican supermajority. And as we were advocating for stronger support in early care and education, we kept getting asked the same question: where is this funding going to come from to support these policy solutions? So we knew we needed to do some work and have some revenue options. So we partnered with, this is where Children's Funding Project came in. We reached out to them and partnered with them, and they were able to provide us great research and revenue options. We started with a question of how do we get up to $10 million-ish to fund into the early childhood system. So that might not seem a lot, but for us in our state, that was a good starting point for us. They provided us this great research and resource, and we were able to use that and have that in our toolbox as we had conversations with legislators. And then around the same time, we worked with the Hunt Institute to convene some lawmakers and partners in Montana, where the idea of some sort of trust fund, a child care trust fund, came to fruition and started to take shape. And we started thinking through how, like, what our legislature would maybe be interested in, what that fund could potentially focus on. So following that time, we went into the 2023 legislative session, and legislation was introduced to create a child care subtrust. And although that didn't pass, it really laid good important groundwork for where we are today. So in 2024, during the interim session, we really doubled down and gathered additional data, hosted conversations in communities, and listened carefully to what families and providers and legislators were really interested in. Next slide. So as 2025 legislative session came around, a dedicated early childhood fund was our #1 policy priority. And one of the things that we're most proud of is how collaborative our policy advocacy was around this solution. In developing our policy agenda, we worked side by side with state and local partners, parents, childcare providers, and communities, and we were really intentional that they had a voice in crafting this solution. We traveled to communities throughout our state and sat down with parents and providers. We hosted webinars to get feedback from people that couldn't be in person, and we conducted some voter polling just to gauge how Montana stood on early childhood issues. When our agenda was finalized with our big audacious goal of passing a dedicated fund, we opened the doors wide and invited others to sign on to it. When it was finalized, 147 different organizations and individuals and groups signed on to the agenda, and we were able to deliver that directly to 150 legislators directly to really start conversations. And then something that I really wanted to note today is that we built amazing partnerships with our state economic development leaders and our state chamber of commerce, who were key champions in this work and really helping to articulate that early care and education is infrastructure for our communities and for our state. So they were really key in our work. And then moving into legislative relationships, we started really early. We started talking early to legislators from both parties, sharing our ideas and testing the waters to get feedback on potential revenue options. They were definitely really important conversations to build that trust and relationship. And then at the same time, we were also talking to our state agencies because we knew that any legislation would potentially impact their work. So we wanted their ideas and input as well. Next slide. So moving into 2025 legislative session, Montana still currently is a Republican majority, although some Democratic legislators did pick up a few new seats this last election. Going into session, we worked with Democratic Senator Laura Smith, who introduced our first trust fund bill, Senate Bill 565, which was our Plan A, $150 million directly into early childhood. And again, for Montana, this was very ambitious, but we really wanted to spark that conversation and draw attention, bring people out to testify, and yeah, just drum up that excitement. This bill actually made it through the Senate chamber, which was further than we thought it would go in the legislative process. So that was really exciting. As that bill was moving, Senator Smith was also working with a House Republican, Lou Jones, who was crafting Plan B bill, which is the bill that eventually passed. His bill, House Bill 924, created a larger trust fund focused on infrastructure. And within that bill, he took language from Plan A bill, reduced the funding amount to $10 million, and put it in his Plan B bill. Throughout the session, our team was in the hallways, talking to legislators, updating our communities about what was happening, and making sure that everyone knew how to engage in advocacy if that's something they wanted to do. Representative Lou Jones' Bill 924 eventually passed both chambers, which included the Early Childhood Special Revenue Account. At the end of the day, bipartisan partnership was key to our success. So on June 19th, 2025, House Bill 924 was signed into law by our governor, creating the Early Childhood Special Revenue Account within Montana's Growth and Opportunities Trust, or the GO Trust. As part of this new account, the bill also established a cross-agency board that is bringing together both public and private representatives to help determine how the funding will be used. The funding in the Early Childhood Special Revenue Account was designed to be really flexible so it could adapt to the changing needs of children and families over the time, with the main focus being on childcare access, affordability, and quality. But some of the other things that were written into the use of the fund include infant-toddler initiatives, improving quality in early learning environments, expanding before and after school care, and supporting innovative initiatives as well. So this fund, to go into funding, and then I'll wrap up. Luckily, when we were having conversations, Lou Jones had an idea of how he wanted to fund his larger GO Trust. And so it made our work a little bit easier. We were able to focus on getting advocates to the table and other things. But our fund is specifically funded by general fund dollars the first 3 fiscal years. And then After that initial transfer, it's funded by volatile revenue, which is tax on capital gains income, tax on partnership income, and the interest earned. And the early childhood special revenue account gets 10 million initially and then receives interest earned from the larger Go Trust, a little under 3 million a year, and it grows as the years ahead. So that's about the early childhood trust funding portion. And yeah, I look forward to answering any questions that you have. And thank you for the time today. And I'll pass it back to Bruno.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate that, Alex. Thanks for being here today. And yeah, here information if you want to learn more, hear more from her. I know we'll share this as well. But did want to segue into our other partner here, Eva, the director of the Child Care for Connecticut Coalition, who also managed to get something done in her state this year. So, Eva, if you don't mind taking it away.
Thank you for having me, and glad to be here. I just wanted to kick off with what many advocates already know within the space of early care and education, that from what Bruno, what Olivia, and the Children's Funding Project have made it very clear, there is no set way to do this, right? There's no right way or wrong way, and there isn't exactly a perfect roadmap for every state. And I start there because in Connecticut's journey to figure out what makes sense for us, we really reached out to partners in other states all throughout who already had coalitions up and running, some of them many years in to trying to transform childcare and this fight. And we found out that everyone was doing things slightly differently. That knowledge allowed us to be a little bit more delicate with ourselves and feel a little bit better that why aren't we, so ahead of the curve? Why is Connecticut not already there? Well, the reminder is that the nation isn't there, and we all have to do this together, each state really taking it upon themselves, nonprofits and coalitions, to get something done. Because on the federal level, it's just not, hopefully soon we'll get there. But on state levels, we have to take it upon ourselves. So I wanted to kick it off with that. The coalition Childcare for CT, and in our next slide, it highlights our mission and our vision, very similar to a lot of coalitions in other states. We were really focusing on, and the word might sound corny, holistic, right? A holistic way to change childcare. We didn't want to do just changes in the childcare workforce and the educators who get paid so bad, their payments abysmal. We didn't just want to concentrate on them. We didn't just want to concentrate on the parents who really struggle with affordability. We were really trying to create a system that brought those two realities together and found solutions as fast as we could for the parents and for the educators. In that conversation, our goal as a mission was trying to get universal childcare paths. And I know that the definition of childcare really depends on who you're talking to. For some, like we all heard recently in New Mexico, universal goes into the word free. In our conversation internally, when we were discussing what could Connecticut do, what's feasible, we were looking at that 75% being publicly funded and finding opportunities to reduce the cost of care. If we can get to free, fantastic. But we are really trying to step into this into our dream and feasibility combined together. Who makes up the coalition in the very beginnings of our work was the child care educator workforce. And very quickly, we noticed that we cannot build a coalition. We cannot build and transform childcare in Connecticut if we didn't have the business community at the table, if we didn't have parents at the table. The creation of childcare for CT came out of necessity. COVID shined a spotlight on childcare everywhere, and here in Connecticut, like everywhere else, close to 30% of the workforce in childcare was decimated, gone. They either the workforce lost slots and were forced to shut down, or through sickness and through being, just going through the pandemic, were not available to parents. Because of that, partners and I started these weekly calls 1 week into the shutdown that were providing resources to the educators trying to figure out how to navigate the pandemic. And those calls that started with just like 20 people here and there, then 80, quickly transformed by word of mouth to 1,000 people. Those 1,000 people kept coming back. And a year into those calls, we took a step back and reflected and said, we have something here. The community is eager to make change happen. We've got to use this horrible pandemic and horrible moment as a catalyst to catapult us into some change and legislative conversation. In one of those calls, one of our providers that routinely came, and I have to give Georgia Goldburn a shout out. She's a childcare owner operator and also has a nonprofit circle, said, we got to go and strike. It's time to strike. This is really happening. And in conversation of, why striking might be not the path for everyone, for parents, accessibility, as well as some of the unionized childcare providers in the workforce, we came up with the compromise of morning without childcare, where providers shut down for an hour or two. Those who couldn't shut down had a field trip with the children. And in our first year, we had over 1,000 people show up in that community to rally together and say, we need childcare funding. We really need support. And that went national for Day Without Childcare. We've been doing those rallies every single year since then. And, fast forwarding 3 years of rallies, I can say that if it wasn't for the creation of the community, the fact that we were in a desperate moment, we weren't going to be able to get to where we are now. And I'll highlight in the next slide where we are. Just dive right into what Connecticut got. So very excited to share with everyone on this call that Connecticut does have a universal childcare program, and to pay for it, we created a universal childcare endowment. Borrowing and mimicking what other states already had, we also, to get to this conclusion and to what is right for Connecticut, we are very fortunate to partner with the Children's Funding Project, as well as Prenatal to 5 strategies, to get us the research and the real analysis and comprehension of what makes sense for us and what already exists in Connecticut. So some of the questions of, is an excise tax where I want to go or where I need to go? Is that feasible? The questions of, do I have a resource that I can tap into? When we were looking at our analysis provided to us, and we were trying to navigate those difficult conversations with legislators, it was very clear that Connecticut doesn't have mining. We don't have a commodity. One might say that maybe our commodity is rich people, but we're not in a place legislatively where there is appetite to raise taxes, create new revenue through taxes, and we definitely didn't have a natural resource that we can tap into. So to get to the endowment, what we did have was a significant surplus that already existed. While some states were seeing deficits during the pandemic, or maybe a surplus of 500,000, a couple thousand, we were looking at close to $4 billion in reserves. This is to not go too much in the nitty gritty. This is a significant amount of money because already we had our rainy day fund capped. It was full. It was flourishing. We had other 2 buckets of money that were also capped, full, and flourishing. So this reserve money was in addition to 3 buckets of money that already were billowing out more cash. And with a lot of the nonprofit partners and community members in our coalition struggling to try to convince the legislators to give up that money and use that money, because of maybe the subject matter, trying to focus that excess money on housing or focus that money on healthcare, we were able to convince the legislative leadership that the money should go to childcare because of the return on investment. We were also very fortunate that in our coalition with over 70 different nonprofits throughout the state of Connecticut, as well as close to now 15,000 individual members in our coalition, to convince the legislative leadership that this return on investment was truly an impact worthwhile. Part of our community were business leaders. One of the leading organizations in the state, the Connecticut Business Industry Association, was also advocating with us. So what we got was, through the endowment and the universal program, a cap on the cost of totally free childcare for parents who are making less than 100 grand. So if you're making less than 100 grand, it's totally free. Then if you're making over 100 grand, then you have a cap of 7% of your household income. We were mimicking some of the Biden administration recommendations. We also were able to successfully create a new program for health insurance for providers. So educators now have additional subsidy support to get health insurance either affordable or free. We were able to get additional bonding money for capital improvements so we can expand childcare and really support our apprenticeship model and support some other programming that exists. We were able to consolidate our Head Start program. So now we have something called Early Start. So it consolidates subsidy programs into one program to streamline and help navigate how childcare works. And we were able to get legislation to create a platform, a web page where parents could log in, really sign up in live time for childcare, and providers can help with the billing process to streamline everything. Altogether, very excited to say that we did get the first installment of money in our endowment of $300,000 a month ago. And we have our first installment of slots getting to be activated and real January 2026, already happening very soon. So we are building the plane as we're flying it, but we're motivated and we're excited to keep advocating because this is just the beginning. As we've seen with New Mexico and other states, even though when you pass monumental and transformational legislation, we're still borrowing, we're still observing what other states are doing, and that only helps the community as a whole. And we're also trying to make sure that we're striving for a decade of transformation. A quick highlight before I summarize of what got us here, in addition to the awesome coalition building that we did, and really getting a groundswell with parents and businesses involved and engaged in this conversation. Social media. Social media was so key because our team is very small. As a team, our capacity is not exactly as far-reaching as we wanted it to be because it's only 6 staffers. So we weren't able to be at every house and every event, but through digital media and digital organizing, taking the petitions, the signatures, the names of people who started interacting with us through a post, and then transforming that post into real human contact, into letter writings, into hearings, and then into rallies, really catapulted us into that transformational change that happened so quickly. Lastly, just to summarize, with Childcare for CT, we were able to have a timeline, and Bruno, you can just go to the timeline slide, and then I'll stop there. So I think there we go. So we were able to have a timeline that was much quicker than most nonprofits here in the state of Connecticut. In Connecticut, we have paid family leave that took over 10 years to pass. But because of using the crisis, making sure that parents and providers were working together as a team, making sure that we had the business industry really understanding the return on investment and the impact on the workforce, every single year we met the goals that we were creating for ourselves. And then going into 2025, we were successful with passing legislation. Leadership is everything, right? Having legislative leadership and governors on your side really make the difference of expediting that timeline. But leaving it on a positive note, if anyone tells you it takes 10, 20 years to get there, it's not real, because the timeline is what you make of it. Thank you, guys.
Thanks for that, Eva. And Alex, I think we're going to transition into a little bit of a dialogue next. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. Bruno, I think I was keeping an eye on the questions, and
yeah.
folks have had lots of awesome questions for you and Alex and Eva. One of the first questions for both Alex and Eva, people were curious, did this work? Did your participation require any lobbying or formal advocacy? How did your organizations specifically approach that? And did that cost you all money from a specific vendor? People are really curious about how to do that piece.
I can jump in. That's a great question. We did. We're lucky because we do have philanthropic dollars to support our work as a 501(c)(3) nonprofit. We did do some lobbying as an organization, and we contracted with someone within our state that really helped us with some of that governmental affairs and was able to do some lobbying on behalf of us within, the ability that our organization did have to do that.
And then we are also a 501(c)(3 when we were looking for a fiduciary. So we knew that our coalition would be a moment in time. We didn't expect to create a nonprofit that would last forevermore. That just made more sense in Connecticut based on all the different nonprofits that work in the early childhood space. So when we were looking at a fiduciary, we wanted to make sure that that fiduciary had enough in revenue to give us the wiggle room to do advocacy. So through the 501(c)(3 rules, you have a very clear cap of how much you can lobby. So we didn't want to put in jeopardize our fiduciary and put them in a situation that we were lobbying too much or spending too much money on lobbying. So that was very key, looking for a fiduciary that had that flexibility because of the income that they were generating. Through that flexibility, we were able to lobby with staff. So we have three registered lobbyists in our team on staff, but we were also able to contract for the first year, about $100,000 we spent to contract a lobbyist team, a firm here in Connecticut that's very well known, Penn Lincoln, with educational lobbying, and they also assisted with tracking bills, being on the ground, talking to legislators, basically filling in those gaps of those moments that our team physically couldn't be there. I have to say that without a lobbying team who was there all the time at the Capitol, I don't think we would have had the success that we had.
And another question to both of you related to lobbying. Folks were curious about examples of pushback that you might have gotten from policymakers and how you overcame that, or cases where you didn't but neutralized it. But I think folks are specifically asking, what are the arguments against dedicated funds that you heard?
So
Go ahead, Eva.
I'll kick it off. We made a complete pivot because we did have pushback in the beginning of our campaign, going back 4 years ago. Our messaging was kid-centered. Everything that, from our photos to our branding to our documents, our leaflets, to even what we were saying, was always like, do this because we care about the kids, do it because the kids matter. And unfortunately, legislators were not receptive. A lot of the legislative body here in Connecticut are older. If they had kids a long time ago. The pushback that we got was childcare doesn't cost that much. As we know on this call, that is not real. We also got pushback as to my constituency doesn't care about this topic. My constituency doesn't want to pay for your childcare. If I had to pay for childcare, why should I pay for your childcare? In legislative hearings in the very beginning, I remember in a finance committee, the chairs laughed at us when we asked for close to $1 billion for support and said that's an absurd number. Why in the world would you ever need that much money? Why is this problem so major? And it took really 2 years to rebrand and pivot and then concentrate on the workforce issue, concentrate on the impact on businesses, where then legislators really came around and started listening and paying attention, getting more people to testify that were small business owners and making legislators truly hear from their constituency and saying, this does impact us and it impacts everyone, was also a shift that was beneficial.
I think for us, the main pushback was just around spending fiscal. It's raining fiscal notes. We don't want to spend that much money. We're spending a lot of money. And we were able to really highlight that this is like one-time funding, which then will be able to grow and be a sustainable investment. And I do think that that was something that legislators really liked in our state. Um, and I will just say that since our account was broad, I mean, it did have a childcare focus, but was a little more broad, a lot of different voices were able to show up in support, including, like I said, our Chamber of Commerce, our economic development organizations, our business leaders, and be able to talk to different components of the bill. So that really resonated with a lot of different legislators. So yeah, that's what I would say.
And Eva, it looks like we've gotten a couple questions, just points of clarification specifically about whether the goal of 75% funding coverage reflects 75% of the state or 75% of what a family would pay. And then also, how many families do you anticipate will be covered by the 300 million?
So we wanted the 75 was what a family would pay, and then we started promoting a cap of 7% of a family's annual income. Luckily, the state ran with that. So the final version of the bill was a 7% cap when you're making 100 grand or more, and then totally free if you're under that. The internal debate with leadership was we don't have enough money to make it free for everyone, and as advocates, we had to make the very difficult decision to say, we understand, we know that because it's an endowment, we have to wait for the money to accrue before you can pull out of it. And those decisions are impacting people, right? So it's like, do you say totally free? But if it's totally free because money's finite, you're going to impact a smaller amount of people. Or do you say, do you find a middle ground of free for X amount of people by SMI or by creating a cap, and then not free but low and affordable for others to allow more people in the system? That was negotiated, right? That was the middle ground between the governor and the legislature and advocates. Our hope is once we keep advocating for more money to be put into the fund and then the fund does mature, that we can get to a place where New Mexico went totally free. We're in our infancy, so right now we're not there yet, but we would love a reality where it could be totally free from infant from birth to 5 years old. And we would also love a reality that the legislative bill can be expanded past the 5-year-old age all the way to 12 years old to incorporate after school, before school, summer camp, the other types of childcare that are also very expensive.
And Eva and Alex, you both happen to be early childhood focused here, but there are funds included in the paper that are not early childhood focused. And we got some specific questions about out of school time funding and after school and youth funding. And Bruno, I wonder if you can share a couple examples or point people to, or just share what we say about that in the paper and if that's included.
Yeah, and definitely within the paper you'll find the uses of funding, including after school and out of school funding. Off the top of my head, so Alaska has a dedicated source of revenue, marijuana, cannabis tax. Some of that is dedicated to after school and out of school programs. Massachusetts dedicates some of their gambling tax to after school and out of school programs. There are a few more, like Tennessee relies on lottery revenue in order to fund some after school and summer programs. I did see a specific question about why Pennsylvania's boost legislation wasn't included. So without getting into the nitty gritty of that, I could have just been wrong. So I do want to throw out that, like, I did my best, but there's a lot of states out there and a lot of different funds. If you think I missed something, please reach out to me and I'd be happy to incorporate it if it does fit the criteria. I will say there were some that were on the margin because we tried to make a distinction between, is this something that's dedicated and kind of out of the administration's hands, or is this something that the administration can decide they want to fund or not? And so I'm not going to answer about that boost fund in particular because I'm not familiar enough with it to know. But there were some that were on the bubble for that reason. So just about how we define the term dedicated within this criteria, which again, that more of that is discussed in the paper.
Yeah, that's a great point, Bruno. So like Bruno said, there have been a couple people in the Q&A who have asked about specific states, and I would really encourage you to email Bruno about them because there are someone asked about the Florida lottery dollars that partially fund voluntary pre-K, and because that goes to a big education enhancement trust that is not necessarily dedicated year after year to things outside of the K-12 school day, even though it's mostly, or not mostly, but somewhat used for voluntary pre-K, that like fell on the bubble of dedication for us. Like, is that dedicated to pre-K? But also we're always happy to discuss and debate the ones on the margin and kind of veer towards being a bit more inclusive at sometimes we want people to hear about more of the opportunities. So yes, and also things have happened. Things have been moving and been happening, and there are things we could have missed, and some of these were passed before I was born. So please let us know if there are others that we missed. Bruno, another question to you, though. I think Eva and Alex, if you have an answer, also jump in on this. But are there any examples of coalitions in the paper that other sectors, so only part of the revenue raised went to kids outside of K-12, and they may be partnered with like housing or food security or other interests?
Yeah, I'm gonna hand that to Alex, except to give like the brief. Yes, that it's not uncommon for child advocates programs for children and youth to ally with other things. In Montana, I think speak to infrastructure. In New Mexico, it was the K-12 system, in addition to early care, that got investment. So we see a lot of partnerships like that.
Yeah, thanks, Bruno. Like I said, in Montana, the Early Childhood Special Revenue Account is actually nestled within the larger GO Trust or Growth and Opportunities Trust. And within that larger trust, it's really focused on infrastructure items, housing, water, transportation, pension, like many other important issues in the state of Montana. And then early childhood is a kind of a sub account, a smaller trust within that larger Go Trust. So lots of great partnerships in that work and kind of neat to see and unique.
And in Connecticut, we didn't have additional topics that were housed within the money. The money is for early care, but I want to point out that legislators wanted to make it a priority for food security for the children. So they added into our endowment legislation that any child care educator who's participating and receiving money for these slots has to be part of the food program. So there's separate money going into the food program and separate advocacy that's happening to make sure that there's food security. But there is this relationship between the new legislation and existing programs.
That's really helpful, and I think gets to what that person was specifically asking. But kind of the second half of that question, Bruno, I'm wondering if you can editorialize a little bit about the risk of watering down or confusing the message when you're revenue raising to broaden the tent versus the benefits of broadening the tent, and just what kind of your perspective is and what you've seen for people.
Not to not answer the question, but sort of to do that. I really agree with something, Eva, I'm paraphrasing you here, but like there's not a silver bullet or one way to do it, I think. Like certainly there are trade-offs to like, less money for you, more likely to pass, other things to consider. I think what we're hoping to give you all is like a guide for how to think about that and additional resources to help you answer those questions in your area, right? So it just depends on what's going on in, Montana or Connecticut, what trade-offs are worth it. And really, I rely on folks like Eva and Alex, people on the ground actually doing the work to know. We're just here to try and help provide guidance.
Well, we really appreciate both of our panelists, both for being willing to share this with other folks, but also for the work that you all are specifically doing and continuing. Bruno, if you want to just pull up that final slides that folks want to know and maybe Eva and Alex, if you can be thinking about whether you have an answer to throw in the chat to this question. But folks want to know kind of what's the next step? If I want to do this, what should I do? And I think the first thing on the slide that Bruno's pulling up is read the paper. That's our number one suggestion of read the paper. There's lots of good nuggets in there that speaks to exactly what Bruno just said. There are many ways to do this. If you have feedback or additions, like we said, please do email Bruno about those. We really are, we're calling this comprehensive based on what we've read and seen, but would love for it to be more truly comprehensive if folks have additions or edits. If you want to learn more about any of the resources mentioned during this, Kristen on our team was keeping the chat going with lots of links dropped in, but we will also email those in follow up. And then if you'd like to talk about next steps and how you could move forward with something like this, also email Bruno. And I'll just make a plug for something we're saying to everybody this year is that there's a lot of interest in doing state level revenue raising work. And there are a lot of organizations in each state with some shared goals. So we would really encourage you to think about, is there an Alliance for Early Success State Coalition, a 50 State After School Network State Coalition, your state's partnership, Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, like revenue focused people thinking about this. Look at all the networks and see if you can make a bigger table to that last point of folks who are interested in revenue raising in your state, or get on a train that's already moving and make sure kids are represented on it. So I think that's everything. We hope that this paper is useful and has useful tools. Please send us feedback. And thank you so much to Bruno and Eva and Alex for their expertise and their time. Thanks so much, everybody.